So all the scenes that you've just seen have been taken directly after the deposition of an infamous dictator. It's a delightful idea, no doubt. The oppressed people all united in their shared goal of toppling totalitarianism. But this notion, delightful as it is, well, essentially just an unrealistic myth. As any revolution, essentially, throughout all of history is actually made up of a very broad church of people's views and beliefs, who, for all intents and purposes, cast away their countless issues with one another to combat a common enemy, which is undoubtedly a revolution's greatest strength, but also, by far, its biggest weakness, as it makes any anti-government uprising susceptible to the oldest trick in the book: divide and conquer, a timeless strategy that was utilized with Machiavellian perfection by Iran in 2022 in light of protests there. So this video forms part of a two-part series on why the Iranian uprising failed, where in part 1, which was not a necessary watch for this video, nonetheless comes highly recommended, we went over how anti-government protests were, contrary to most Western media narratives, based not only on women's rights, but also a broad anti-government coalition made up of a lot more sectors of Iranian society, many of which a lot less liberal in their perspective and motivated more by either economic concerns or an opposition to the president rather than the system itself. And in this video, we'll now zero in on the events of the revolution itself, highlighting the theocratic government's approach to it and how it effectively utilized existing ideological divides to completely shatter the dreams of any ideologues who may have envisioned a new country and a brighter future. So, without further ado, my name is Sean. This is Into the Ether, and today we ask, why did the Iranian protests fail? Part 2.
Unprecedented protest across Iran.
Cutting their hair in public.
Protesters shout death to Khamenei.
The regime has shown no signs of letting up.
Fighting with police went on into the night.
Fired live rounds at unarmed protesters.
People arrested and more than 500 killed.
Part 1. No Plan B. This is a picture of Iran's former dictator, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who in 1978 was forcefully removed from power by the current regime. And in this photo, Pahlavi can be seen living a very lavish life, surrounded by exotic seas, wondrous sights, and luxuries that most people can only dream about, really. Now, they say that a photo says 1,000 words, and this image pretty perfectly encapsulates why. Because hidden beyond its glamour actually sits a story that pretty perfectly explains why Iran's 2022 protests failed. So, I know what you're thinking right now. How does a picture of a Persian dictator living in luxury, taken decades ago mind you, explain why the 2022 Iranian protests failed? Well, the answer to that question, because believe it or not, this photo was actually taken after his ousting from power at the hands of Ayatollah Khamenei's revolution, which is pretty surprising considering that the life of a deposed dictator is, well, usually a lot less glamorous. So what gives? Well, essentially, throughout the entirety of Shah Pahlavi's brutal and oppressive reign, his power was, for all intents and purposes, heavily propped up by British and US support. Now, I say this not to condemn British imperialism or US foreign policy. That's an issue for another video. No, the reason I bring this up is to properly contextualize Shah Pahlavi's predicament upon the inception of the Islamic Revolution, where amidst what was a pretty dangerous situation for him, Pahlavi essentially had two options in front of him. Either A, fight to retain power at the risk of losing, and ultimately meeting the same ending as former authoritarians deposed by revolutions, or B, give up power and escape into the protective thumb of his British and American allies. Where, needless to say, Pahlavi chose option B. But fast forward to 2022, and that option was never even a possibility for the powers that be in Iran, who in their decades of power implemented a foreign policy that's, well, widely unpopular not only amongst most of their regional neighbors, but also with the world's greatest superpower. And whilst relations with other superpowers are somewhat less tense, this was certainly not enough to assure safety and self-exile for the regime's high rollers. And thus, for the Iranian regime in 2022, the only path to survival involved one thing and one thing only: decisively crushing the revolution in every manner possible. And because of their knowledge of this fact, the Iranian regime had actually set themselves up with insurance-like precision and consideration for this issue specifically, meaning that in 2022, starkly in opposition to 1978, the Iranian authorities were more than well prepared to deal with this problem with a surgical level of effectiveness. Part 2. Underwriting Revolution. So, have you ever wondered what a dead man walking looks like? This is Mohammad Mohadesh, Iran's democratically elected former prime minister, who actually managed to successfully wrestle away almost all powers from the authoritarian Shah in the 1950s. All until a US and UK organized coup would eventually oust him from power in favor of a resurgent Shah, who in turn arrested his former prime minister. And this picture of the would-be father of an alternative Iran in handcuffs and facing a potential death sentence, again, says 1,000 words, as it perfectly highlights one very important principle of any revolution. Gaining power was one thing, but retaining it? Now that's the true challenge. So fast forward to 1978, and we can now understand that after the Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini's priority above anything else was not necessarily forming a functional regime, but instead a well-protected one that fully shielded all of its power players, and one that is properly insured against all threats, from coups d'etats to foreign interference, and perhaps most importantly, the very thing that brought it to power in the first place: revolution. And it's for this purpose that the infamous Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, or IRGC, was formed. Now, this institution is as infamous as it is complex, as the agency that has been designated as a terrorist organization by multiple states has its hands in so many pies that it merits a video in and of itself. So for the scope of this video, we'll instead focus exclusively on all insurances that very effectively protected the Iranian supreme leader's grip of power. But prior to delving into that, let us first dive into one of the most foundational lessons that the regime had learned upon their inception. Part 3. A lesson written in red. So let me ask you a question. What weapon do you think is best suited for suppressing a popular uprising? Tanks? Armored vehicles? Explosives? Semi-automatic machine guns? Soldiers? Police? Well, all these things are undoubtedly very useful. But here's the thing, right? Shah Pahlavi had access to all these things, and yet still he fell. And the reason for this is because setting fire to your own country and then ruling over a bunch of corpses really has no true value, both morally and perhaps more crucially for authoritarians, economically too. Which means that suppressing revolution is a lot less an aspect of raw power and a lot more of an ideological chess game of sorts, with the primary aims of the game being both isolation and destruction, a lesson that the Iranian regime had learned very well by the story of this man. This is Ali Shariati, a famous Iranian scholar and revolutionary whose many admirers include even the current Iranian supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. But something about Shariati is actually pretty shocking. His ideological inspirations, which includes names such as Jean-Paul Sartre, Frantz Fanon, and Karl Marx. all of which being not only academic giants stemming from the evil Western world, but also staunch supporters of communism, an ideology that during its rise was characterized not only upon an exclusively secular sentiment, but also an overtly anti-religious one, with its main political manifestation seen predominantly within the Soviet Union and its trademark brand of state atheism essentially. Or in other words, the polar opposite of what Iran would eventually become. So what gives? Why would the current leader of a theocratic Iran express any sort of admiration for someone like Shariati? Well, because Shariati, who was both an Islamist and a socialist, actually represented a very important bridge for success in the anti-Shah uprising of the late 1970s, as it created the opportunity for an alliance between Iranian Islamists and Iranian socialists, who alongside liberals left over from the Mohadesh era created an unstoppable pluralistic alliance that would in turn completely overthrow Pahlavi. Now, needless to say that the story for Iranian liberals and socialists after the Islamic Republic's rise did not end well. But regardless of that, the lesson still stands that without this alliance, the Pahlavi dynasty may still be ruling over Iran today. So, a telling lesson in the importance of ideological alliances. Alliances such as the one that was seen in 2022. But that, unfortunately for them, had been a lesson learned all too well by the Iranian regime, who were in turn armed with one of the most effective tools for implementing a lethal divide and conquer strategy. Part 4. The Information Virus. So, over the years, a lot has been said about the importance of propaganda for the sustainability of any authoritarian regime. But here's the thing, right? We live in the age of the internet, where unfathomable amounts of information is literally available to us at the palm of our fingers. And despite some government ability to control internet access, this is ultimately pretty bypassable to anybody who knows what they're doing really, thus rendering the ability to completely monopolize information all but impossible. So, in light of that, one would assume the age of information suppression to be all but dead and buried. Furthermore, add to the fact that the fuel of revolution sparked by Amini's death truly caught fire through social media, and, well, again, one would in turn wonder, how the hell can the Iranian regime suppress information in the age of the internet? And the answer to that question? Pretty easily, actually. Because of topless white women. So let us momentarily turn our attention to Europe and North America, where upon hearing of the Iranian protests were nothing short of jubilant, not only because of how profoundly it weakened one of their greatest geopolitical enemies, but also because of the clearly liberal, and dare I say feminist tinge of said protests, a sentiment that Western media outlets were keen to very heavily lean into, in the process gaining the attention of mostly progressive Western pressure groups that's primary focus was on issues such as women's rights, LGBT inclusion, and more, all of which were very keen to highlight their passionate support for the Iranian protests. So far so good, right? I mean, as indicated in the previous video, women in Iran aren't exactly treated in the fairest of manners. But here's the thing, right? As I also highlighted in a previous video, the Iranian protests were not an exclusively feminist issue. Far from it, in fact, as the overall protester base was actually made up of a very broad church of government-bereaved groups. Amongst them minority groups and a much larger sector of pretty conservative, middle-class, Persian, Shiite, and male individuals, all of which with vastly different goals within a very complicated Iranian political structure. That's decentralized nature rendered protesters unable to rally around the common enemy, as was the case with Shah Pahlavi, who, unlike the supreme leader, essentially lorded over every single political institution, thus creating a unified target. So in 2022, while some protesters may have wanted a complete regime overthrow, Others wanted either the president's resignation, or police reform, or even something as simple as economic policy change, thus shielding the Ayatollah from a unified wrath. Okay, fair enough, but what about the topless white women? How did they have anything to do with this? Well, because as you may be aware, protests in European countries tend to get a little feisty sometimes, even featuring a trend of topless protests which aim to showcase dissent against gender discrimination, with said protests looking something like this, or even this, which was an Amsterdam organized rally in solidarity with Iranian women. And a rally significant of a Western response to protests, which, in truth, did a lot more to hurt the cause rather than to help it. And this is where we divert back to the issue of information monopolization. Because within a world where information is accessible at a record ease, this helps in the spread of not only a revolutionary spirit, but also the rampant virality of an overwhelming amount of fake news and disinformation. A deceptive art that the Iranian regime has developed into a true Picasso within. And what better canvas for doing so than a topless protest in Europe, which you can very easily claim to be from within Iran, as evident by this fake news report. Aimed at painting Iranian women seeking equal rights as a bunch of crazy, radical fundamentalists, hell-bent on breaking the moral fabric of Iran's righteously constructed Islamic society. Which may seem to be a little bit ridiculous, but considering how statistically susceptible all people seem to be to fake news, this was actually an incredibly powerful tool, further enhanced by images stemming from the aforementioned Western media outlets that made this full sentiment all the more easy to paint. Though I definitely don't want to turn this into an all this is the West's fault sort of thing, because it's certainly the case that the Iranian regime also utilized very Iranian biases and stereotypes to divide the aforementioned Persian conservative protester base not only from the more liberal section, but also from minorities, whose protests they were very keen to label as acts of terrorism. And with mistrust and division growing ever more rampant within the protester alliance, the setting was now perfectly set for the regime to bring the big guns out. Part 5. Conquer. This is Sarah Hussain, a Bangladeshi lawyer and human rights activist who in 2022 was appointed as the UN chair for a fact-finding mission on human rights abuses in Iran, a country that isn't exactly the best reputed in this regard. And yet, even despite this, even the hardened delegation was nothing short of shocked about the true brutal realities of Iran's response to the 2022 uprising, with the related report highlighting massive human rights abuses, from unlawful arrests to the full-on firing upon peaceful anti-government protesters by the police, with certain estimates showing the casualties of the period reaching a number close to the thousands, and with the brunt of the government's wrath felt primarily within minority-populated regions. Specifically, on one seminal day, on Friday, the 30th of September 2022, Zahedan, or as it's known today, Bloody Friday. This is a black box because, to tell you the truth, I couldn't find any photos of this day that are in any manner YouTube friendly. As from the reported events of the day, Iranian forces audaciously opened direct fire not only upon peaceful protesters, but also indiscriminately upon a Sunni mosque, eventually leading to casualties in the hundreds. Meanwhile, women's rights protesters, which were a lot more dispersed than minority groups, were instead subject not to direct violence, but instead a series of targeted arrests, with the overall arrests of the period reaching a number well into the tens of thousands. And among said arrestees being people like Safa Ayeli, Masha Amini's uncle, and even Nilufar Hamedi, the journalist whose photograph of Masha Amini's grieving parents sparked protests to begin with. And considering reports of widespread torture within Iranian prisons, said campaigners probably didn't fare much better than their minority counterparts. And whilst the more traditional Persian Shiite male protester base was subject to a much less severe crackdown, these events nonetheless served as a roaring warning. one so loud that protests gradually began to diminish, and diminish, and diminish, until the once so blistering cry of revolution became but a tame flame in the wind. Part 6. Conclusion. So, not exactly the happiest of endings, which therefore begs the question, was it all for nothing? Well, not exactly, because an interesting twist of fate that shocked the world this year would maybe highlight the Iranian protests to have had some sort of reverberations in Iranian politics. As after a helicopter crash that would claim the life of the then incumbent President Ibrahim Raisi, new elections were called by the supreme leader, which would in turn be won by a pretty reformist candidate by the name of Mazoud Pezeshkian, who has actually publicly declared solidarity with both Masha Amini and the protests that followed. Though with the country still officially led by the supreme leader, it nonetheless remains to be seen if any sort of alternative future for Iran will ever be possible. Well, I guess we'll just have to wait and see. This has been Sean from Into the Ether. If you liked the video, please like, comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to be alerted of future videos. Thanks for watching, and ciao!